Bienvenue. Nous sommes ravis de vous retrouver pour un nouveau cycle, une nouvelle série
So, good
de
afternoon, everyone.
webinaires
We are happy
qui
to
est
see you
portée
again for
d'abord
another
par
cycle of
l'Observatoire
webinars
du littoral, mais qui a été
that has been
largement
organized
reconduite
by
avec
ECO and
notre collègue
Conservatoire du Littoral,
de
but it's
Smilo.
also
Donc voilà, elle
co-produced
cofonde le PIM
with our
qui est un organisme
Smilo
international
colleagues.
et
So,
c'est vraiment une
we
production
are so
intéressante
happy
sur laquelle
to
on a
have
fait
done this
beaucoup de
joint
demandes l'année dernière.
production.
Donc
We have had a lot of demand
l'évaluation des
on this
besoins,
type
envies et
of
souhaits des nouveaux webinaires.
production. And so
Ce cycle porte sur la gestion
this
des espèces
cycle
invasives
talks
sur
about
les îles.
management
Quatre
of
épisodes pour ce
invasive
CD.
species on small
Aujourd'hui,
island.
nous
We're going
sommes
to
le
have
premier.
4 episodes.
Qu'est-ce qu'on
Today
fait
is the
avant
first one.
de
What we
lancer
do
l'éradication?
before
Comment on se
starting
prépare, comment on
eradication, how
anticipation,
do we
planification
prepare
des luttes, comment
and
on échange avec
anticipate and
les communautés
plan, and
locales, les
how do
habitants, les
we
partenaires.
exchange
La
with
semaine
local
prochaine, le
communities,
deuxième épisode sera
inhabitants, and
sur
partners.
qu'est-ce qu'on fait
Next week, we're
après,
going to have
on a
a
terminé l'éradication,
webinar on what
ensuite
we do
évaluer
after the
la finalité,
eradication,
s'assurer
therefore
qu'effectivement
following, follow-up,
l'investissement vaille
assessment,
le coup et soit suffisamment
capitalizing
durable. Justement,
investments.
d'abord après le
The
17 mars,
week
on va faire une
after
session avec un
19th
très
of
beau dossier
March,
spécial
we are
sur les
going to
ongulés.
do a
Comment
special
les
session
ongulés,
on ungulates.
comment on gère les ongulés
So,
sur les
how
îles.
we
On
are
aura
going to manage
ça va être
those
très intéressant
on
pour
the
différentes
island. It's going to
zones
be
de la planète. Et
extremely
ensuite, le 26
interesting.
mars,
And
fin
then
dernier
on
épisode de la
March
série sur la gestion
26th,
des reptiles, qui est
we
un
are
sujet
going to
moins évoqué.
talk about
Donc voilà,
management of reptiles.
un peu d'autres
So,
mammifères, mais sur les
rats
reptiles,
and cats,
etc.
and
Donc,
also other
vous pouvez
types
suivre ce dernier
of
épisode
animals
le
on small
jeudi
islands.
26 mars.
So, that's going to be Thursday,
Est-ce que
the
nous nous retrouvons pour la
26th.
première fois?
So, for those of you who are here
Aujourd'hui, nous
for
avons
the first
trois
time
intervenants, une
with
partie,
us,
et je
we
vais les
have
présenter tout de suite.
3
Ensuite,
speakers, and I will
suivra.
introduce
Donc,
them
si vous
to
voulez
you
participer au débat,
later on. So,
poser
if
des
you
questions,
want to take
ça se
part
fait à
into
travers la
the
boîte à questions
debate
que
and
vous
ask
retrouvez
questions,
en
you
bas
can do
de
so with
l'application,
the
le
question
Q&A
box.
qui est en
You
bas.
can
Voilà.
use the Q&A
Vous écrivez vos questions
application,
là-dessus. Nous, on les
um,
synthétise, on les
and
regroupe
we are going to
par sujet
regroup and
sur lesquels
sum
on peut vous
up
répondre
your
facilement. Voilà.
questions, and
Elles
so
seront posées à
we'll
la
be
fin.
able to answer to you.
Pour
This is
cette
going to happen at
webinaire,
the
il
end
y a
of
un
the
interprétariat, une
webinar. There is
interprète qui existe
interpreting.
actuellement, et donc vous pourrez suivre
The
nos
interpreter
débats
is speaking
soit
right
en français,
now
soit en anglais.
in English
Vous
and
pouvez changer de
French.
canal
So
en
you
fonction
can
de la
change
langue
your
que vous
channel
écoutez,
in
puisqu'aujourd'hui
function
nous
of the
allons
language you
parler
want to
dans les deux langues.
listen, because we are going to speak
Tout
in
ça va être
both
enregistré, ça va
languages
être
today. Everything will
retrouvé
be
sur votre chaîne YouTube,
recorded,
que
and
vous
you
avez déjà
will be able to find it on
deux
the YouTube
webinaires passés
channel, where there
sur
is a lot. There is
plus
the last
intéressants.
webinars. They were all very, very interesting.
L'équipe qui a travaillé au
So
niveau
this is the
du Conservatoire
staff
du
that
littoral
is
et PIM sur
working for
l'organisation.
PIM and
C'est
Conservatoire du
l'international
Littoral
du
on
Sénat.
the organization of
Marie, Lise
this
et Angélique qui ont vraiment travaillé
webinar.
en amont à
Marie-Lise
échanger avec les
and
différents experts
Angelique,
et
who have worked very hard
l'organisation.
with
Et
the
il y a
different
donc
experts.
double
Isabella, who
interprète,
is
interprète
our interpreter,
français-anglais.
French English.
Aujourd'hui, on a la chance d'avoir
Now, our
trois intervenants
speakers,
qui sont
we
sur
have
les quatre
3
côtes de la
wonderful
planète.
speakers with us
Ils seront
today
sur les autres
at the different corners
heures
of the
d'intervention.
planet.
Elsa Bonnaud de
Elsa
l'Université
Bonnaud
Paris-Saclay,
from
déjà qui est
Université
aussi un
Paris-Saclay.
membre du conseil
She's a
scientifique
member
du
of the
PIM,
scientific
à nos côtés
council of the
super.
PIM
Et comme
initiative,
équipe de gestion
and she's
participative,
very
Julien
expert
Triolo qui est
on
à l'ouest, l'Office national des forêts
problems
basé à
on
Réunion et
invasive
qui fait des travaux
species.
beaucoup
Julien
plus étendus
Triolo, who is
que
responsible for the
Vancouver, où
ecologic
Gregg
pole in
Howald,
the
lui,
Réunion, France, and Gregg Howald,
lui fait partie
who
du
is
conseil d'administration de
part
Smilo, mais qui
and
travaille
Julien
énormément
is
vis-à-vis de la
also
conservation
part
sur
of the
les colonies.
board of
Comment nous se
directors,
passe
and then he is a very important
Nous
strategist
allons aujourd'hui
for us, and
travailler
then
sur
of
les
course
piliers de
Greg,
compréhension et c'était de mettre les
and
bases voilà, dans le cadre de ce
we are
premier
going
épisode,
to
de savoir
set
de
the
quoi on parle,
basis of our
savoir
episodes.
aborder un vocabulaire et des définitions communes
We are going
aborder les
to
enjeux écologiques
create a
et
common
climatiques par
vocabulary,
Greg.
and
Nous allons tous disparaître petit à petit de
Greg
l'écran
is going
et
to
Greg
speak
va
on his side, and
présenter
is going to start with the
son
presentation
parcours d'abord, puis sa
about
présentation.
his
Greg, the
path.
floor is yours.
So the floor is yours, Greg.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon to many of you, and perhaps good evening. My name is Gregg Howald. I bring a long experience in island restoration, now working with the NGO Advanced Conservation Strategy that's headquartered in the United States with an office in the United Spain and the United States. I'm also on the board of Smilo. Currently, I'm based in Canada, and before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that the land under my feet is in the traditional territory of the Indigenous Silks people of the Okanagan Nation that have had an enduring presence stewarding the land since time immemorial. Local stewardship is especially vital for islands that are experiencing accelerating environmental change. And both protecting and enhancing the health of island ecosystems is necessary for communities' economic, cultural, and overall being. Next slide. When we look at why we're focused on islands, they represent just 5% of the Earth's surface, but support a disproportionate amount of our global biodiversity. Upwards of 20% of all of our biodiversity can be found on island ecosystems. However, islands have witnessed upwards of 75% disproportionate amount of our global extinctions. And today, islands support 40% of threatened species. When we look at the causes, the one that stands out are invasive alien species, introduced species brought by people. For all known extinctions linked to invasives, 86% have occurred on islands. Huge implications not only for our global biodiversity, but for the 11% of the global human population that call island home. Next slide. The most common cause of extinctions are introduced mammals, including predators such as the cats and the rats, and the ungulates such as goats, pigs, and deer. Today, our oral and written record recognizes the significance of these events, and no corner of the world has escaped the consequences of introduced species. Invasives are undermining the building blocks of functional ecosystems and represent an existential threat to island communities around the globe. Next slide. But there's an opportunity. As islands are whole functioning ecosystems, invasive species can be removed, permanently eliminating their impacts and facilitating the recovery of biodiversity, often with little input by people. Globally, there's been well over 1,000 eradications to date, the majority having occurred over the last 70 to 80 years, from small offshore rocks to the very large islands. It is a proven conservation tool accelerating to achieve the global goals set out under the Global Biodiversity Framework. The total land area reclaimed from invasive species is going up from the high latitudes to the deep tropics, protecting thousands of species and facilitating the restoration of ecosystems. We can learn from these experiences and how we can learn from these experiences and apply them into the future opportunities. Next slide. All successful projects are guided by a set of principles that are now what we call globally accepted principles of eradication. They provide the guidance for management actions, and at their core, they can divide the three core principles are every individual must be put at risk with the proposed removal techniques. The techniques must remove individuals at a rate faster than they can replace themselves, and the eradication has to be sustainable, effectively keeping immigration at or near zero. Most of these principles are technical in nature, but I point you to the last one in the lower right corner, is that the acknowledgement of the need for the local, regulatory, and the social conditions have to be conducive to supporting the project. These social elements are often as important as the technical elements that we talk so much about. Now let's take a brief look at how these principles are applied. Next slide. Just as each island is unique, every project is unique, but each project follows the same fundamental stepwise process, something that is noted as a process of discovery, essentially a learning as we go, beginning with an assessment of the feasibility through the design, planning, and implementation, eventually leading to the long-term sustaining the island into the future or sustaining the project into the future. The outside yellow and orange rings is a mix of monitoring progress and engagement with the rights holders and stakeholders that will ultimately sustain these projects into the future. Next slide. Another way to visualize this is that projects are working in an adaptive management framework that uses a continuous feedback loop between planning, implementation, and monitoring to evaluate the ongoing feasibility and adjusting as necessary. Integrating data ensures that any changes to actions along the way remain evidence-based to maximize the probability of success. Next slide. But it is not only the operational technical considerations we have to look at. Projects have to balance not only the scientific and operational factors, but the other non-scientific considerations, essential non-scientific considerations that include financial, legal, communication, safety, ethical, and community concerns that are just as critical to the overall success of the project as much as the technical side. And finally, I'll just walk you through one example from a local project that happened here near my backyard. This is Haida Gwaii off the northern coast of British Columbia on the west coast of Canada, just south of Alaska. The Haida people and their presence go back thousands of years, living among the temperate rainforests, relying on the abundance of the cold Pacific Ocean waters for their livelihoods and culture. One of the indicator species is the western red cedar, a tree that grows very large, living for well over 1,000 years and longer, commonly referred to as the tree of life. From these trees, they've carved their totem poles, their canoes for fishing and travel, built their homes. Even the bark was stripped carefully to keep the tree alive to provide for the future, utilizing the bark for fishing line, nets, hats, and even clothing. Next slide. But the introduction of a Sitka black-tailed deer about 100 years ago has created massive change in the Haida Gwaii archipelago. The historically deer-free forest ecosystem has shifted from a rich and biodiverse temperate rainforest. The ecosystem has shifted into one that is moss-covered, what we call a parkland type setting. Lower species richness, and in many places, no recruitment of the cedar tree, a preferred species for the deer. Now that deer are being managed, they're starting in some places of the archipelago, and recovery is starting to begin. The ecosystem is starting to shift. Remove the deer and the forest comes back with little input from people. But it's not just forest recovery, but those important cultural connections. This photo is an elder within the Haida community visiting a site in which deer were removed from the islands, and was the first time in decades that she had seen a seedling of a cedar tree, which represents a connection to the future. What really struck me from this photo is that the seedling is in 1,000 years is the potential to be a canoe, a longhouse, bark, wood for art, but more importantly, it is connecting the future to the past. It represents hope. Finally, we now know that invasive species can have detrimental impacts to biodiversity and communities, but we know that something can be done in many cases. Invasive species can be successfully removed, and we have guidance and principles that are well established and well achieved. The benefits that come from invasive species eradication is clear. The benefits extend well beyond just biodiversity, but we know supports countries and communities in meeting their commitments to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. About 25% of the global targets can be touched with the removal of invasive species from islands. It is arguably one of the single most important and successful conservation tools that we have access to for island ecosystems and can be applied to conserve biodiversity and benefit communities. And with that, I pass this to my colleagues who will share more direct experiences from their good work.
Thank you very much, Greg. It was very clear and very important as an introduction. You've been involved in several experiences like this in the past. What are the main constraints? What are the main topics that will make you say, "Oh my God, it will be hard"? It depends the place in the world. It depends the community. It depends what are the main constraints?
There's two elements to that. One is the scope and the size of the island, and the first step is the feasibility and scoping visit. The one benefit we have, there's a database called the Database on Island Invasive Species Eradications, and when we go visit an island to assess the potential for feasibility, we can put that island in a more clear context. So, for example, the size of the island, the species that we're targeting, the considerations of the logistics, and the potential tools and considerations. But the other side of this, that we know is the social side, the element of the people that are very invested in their communities, very invested in their islands, that rely on these places for their economic connections, their social connections, their cultural well-being. And we're integrating change. We're representing change that has to be owned and committed to by the community. Ultimately, it's their project, it's their program. The long-term protection of the project is really reliant on the investment from the community. And by working with community to have them understand what the potential outcome could be is really something that is a big investment and is usually a starting point for these types of programs.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We will continue the exchange with you at the end of this webinar. Thank you again. Please do not hesitate to ask questions to Gregg directly on the question box. We will speak with your question at the end. Merci beaucoup, Gregg. Nous allons maintenant nous diriger.
So thank you very much, Gregg. So now we are going to have our next speaker from the Ville de Réunion. Julien, I will leave you 1 minute to introduce yourself and then 8-10 minutes for your presentation. Thank you. So thank you. I am Julien Triolo. I have been working at the Réunion Islands for 25 years, and the problem of invasive is exacerbated like in many oceanic islands. So I've tried to elaborate action plans against invasive plants and the ecological restoration of the habitats. So I will focus my presentation on the small island Gombrani in Rodrigue. Donc, yes, it's very important to understand all of the actions that have been carried out. So, to prepare a mission, it's very important to go on site. And of course, we have to identify the geographical basin, the habitats, the species, the original species, the specific species, the bioclimatic aspects, the height, the geological aspect, pedological aspect, so substrate, and of course, the appearance of different plants according to the different climate. What is also very important is the accessibility. It's fundamental for the realization of fighting operations and eradication operations. So it's very important to understand all these elements to start with. So we have to work with a bibliographical research on the internet. Of course, there is a lot of documents and a lot of different information. And it's very important to complete information, especially those information that are lacking. Next slide. Now, before focusing on invasive species, we need to identify the conservation challenges in terms of habitats and species. This is very important, and this will be the focus of our conservation. So it's very important to check what the indigenous species are and also see what are the species that are defavored by the invasive So it's very important to understand what are the indigenous species to keep. So we have to study the typology, we have to take interest in the important habitats of the island, and of course, priorities to be conserved. So it's very important to understand the zoning of the habitats and the function of the salinity gradient, because species and habitats are going to expand along the gradient. So it's very important to understand this aspect, especially at the beginning. So once you get on site, you can establish a list of species and indigenous habitats, and then all of the different plans and management plans existing. I personally advise to create an identification guide of these plans, and then to work and reflect and identify the theoretical positioning along the gradient. So for the invasive species that are present, to start, we have to create a list of all the exotic species that are known on site. Of course, we have to be careful about synonyms, because a lot of names have changed many times, and we have to show the modality of dissemination. Then we have to make a list of all exotic species that could potentially be present in the same bioclimatic area. So on Gombrani, I have made a list of all the species that are known on dry land of the Rodrigue Island. It's very important to understand the positioning of the exotic species along the gradient that are disrupting, for example. So this was the case of Filao and Casuarina. So it is fundamental to carry out a bibliographical research to identify all of the exotic species, to understand what are the most problematic ones, and we have to absolutely collect the best eradication ways that are used around the world. Same thing for indigenous plants, in order to facilitate that recognition during the mission on the land. That is going to be fundamental, because it's going to complete the information that we already have gathered. So in order to win the war, so to speak, and to have a proper action plan, we need to understand how the species are distributed, the exotic and indigenous species and the different habitats. So often there are information on habitats and cartographies that can be very old or incomplete. So it's very important to identify which habitats, which species are no longer in that habitat, so to check with the existing documents. And therefore, it's important to do some sort of pre-cartographic work and to check, for example, aerial photos. Here you can see Casuarina. You can see it so well, the extension on the aerial photo. Sometimes we don't get all of the information. So what is interesting is to identify the role of data that are priority on the land in order to bridge the gap of the information we are lacking. And also it's important to show the path that we have to do on the land, and also, for example, some apertures that can help to understand the timing of the mission with all the priority areas. I just wanted to show you the work that we have done, and we don't have any recent drone photos, but as you can say, we have Google Earth pictures. Okay, we can use those. And you can see, for example, really well in these pictures that there are different types of habitats. And this allows me to do a pre-cartographic work. So before going on site, it's very important to understand existing strategies. Do they respond to conservation challenges, especially to priority ones? So it's very important to understand existing managing plans. And it's very important to look at aerial pictures to see if some actions are actually visible and starting to zone them. And this is, the Gubrani picture. Finally, starting from the different analysis that we have carried out, it's very important to start to predefine an action strategy. Sometimes there are existing strategies indeed, and as I said before, we must complete the information on the most impactant species, and we then can start focusing on different zones and how to manage them. And this analysis is very important because it allows us to create a strategy, and then we have to realize all the different sectors that are a priority. So, local actors, experts, and then all together, it's important to start thinking about the action plan and how to implement it through the mission. I think I've concluded. Thank you so much. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Julien. Thank you. Of course, we mostly talk about rats, but for other mammifers, but also for plants, things are much more complicated. So when we prepared the session, you were talking to us about the eradication of certain species, also floral species. And with flora, it is much more complicated. So sometimes, people think, oh, it's better not to do anything because, they are going to start again to invade, so it's not worth it. What do you think about this? Well, I am for action because I know a lot of people say it's impossible to eradicate everything, but you can certainly control some invasive species, especially the ones that are more harming. I think we have to control them. I think we also have to take into account that often financial human means are limited. So they do not allow us to eradicate or control effectively all of the exotic plants. That's why we absolutely need to define priorities so that money and human means are used as a priority in those priority areas. Because, of course, you cannot fight throughout the island, throughout the site. Thank you so much. This was very clear. I think these are questions that we have already discussed in terms of our choices. So thank you for your contribution. Now, we're going to go to Paris. A lot of questions are appearing in our question box, questions connected to social acceptability, to communication. So I'm going to now leave the floor to Elsa. You have 10 minutes, and we are going to learn a lot from you. So I let you introduce yourself, and then you're going to have 10 minutes to answer to all of these questions about social acceptability and communication. Well, thank you. I am a researcher in Paris. I have been there since 2011. Now I am in Nice. I'm not in Paris because I am researching in between the terrestrial and marine environment. So I work with all the different species and everything that is dynamic and predators. So it's a very important type of research that I'm doing. So today, I'm going to be talking to you about social acceptance. It's quite a complicated subject. I will try and give you some key points according to my experience. And then we can focus on other aspects of my presentation, and we will talk a little bit about the basics. I think it's very important to remember the basics all the time from my experience. Of course, everything we do without social acceptance is not going to be very much at all, especially when we are carrying out operations for eradicating invasive species. So I'm going to go very fast. And I would like to thank Gregg and Julien for their contribution. So before any operation, we have to have solid topics, solid arguments, solid thesis. We have to know the habitats, we have to know their evolution, we have to know all of the native species, all of what we want to preserve, what we want to conserve. Of course, there's going to be decision-making in terms of scientists and researchers. We are going to have to make decisions, and we are going to make those decisions together with local populations to integrate them in the project. We have to convince them, and we have to have them on our side, on our page. That's why we need strong arguments. Of course, we have to talk about biodiversity, but we also have to make these people understand what direction we want biodiversity to take. So, the second step is once we have started making some sort of general we have a general idea, a pre-knowledge of the site, we have to go there, meet people, talk to them. I put this into my slide. We have to organize meetings. I know it takes a long time, a lot of your time, but it's very important. I know sometimes it can be complicated. We've seen this for ourselves. I remember my experience with the Parc National des Calanques. It was very complicated, but the more we want to do, the more we have to open the discussion, the more we can do. It is crucial because without general adhesion of the population, we cannot do very much. So here I have tried to put together all of the available information that are coming from communities, from the inhabitants, from the users, from all the different stakeholders in order to have all the different points together. And of course, when we organize public meetings, it's important to have all of the information that we are going to present you know, this is the first step. Third step. Now, once we have gathered all the information and we have exchanged views, we have to continue spreading information, and I will talk about it a little bit later in my presentation. But I know that everything works when we inform people, especially on islands, because I mostly work with islands. And we have to insist on the fact that islands are particular systems. They are shelter areas. They are hotspots for biodiversity. So it's very important to preserve them. And we cannot play God, you know, quote unquote. You know, I have heard so many theses on what to do, and people preferring birds to mammifers, whatever. So we really have to speak to these people. We have to explain biodiversity. We have to say we are not going against biodiversity. We have to explain that maybe we are not preserving, for example, the small butterfly or the small bird. They are so pretty. No, we are trying to preserve the functional biodiversity of the island. And we want to limit to the minimum the loss of these functions, the functions of the ecosystem. So here, a little reminder, because it's very important, as I was saying, to inform people about the specific characteristics of the islands. You know, people think it's so easy because it's a small environment, and they think it's a small environment, and they think it's a simple environment. However, I would like to insist on this slide, by the way, because ecosystems may be simple, but when these are multi-invaded, we have different phases of the different species that have been introduced, and so there's going to be interactions between the different species, and so we could have a phenomenon of hyper predation. And of course, it's very important. You know, for example, we have introduced, you know, the cat and the... So it's the rat, and so we have to create this circle. Now, the predator will have an important population because they are going to consume points introduced. And they will have also to consume native prey. So, of course, this is very important. The fact that we are taking away a predator that we introduced means a risk of relapse of mesopredator. That means that there's going to be the pressure for predators. So I insist in these terms because we have to take this into account in our eradication operation, but we also have to manage things. For example, in Porco, we have managed domestic cats without being able to eradicate rats. And so we have not observed a relapse of mesopredators. So in the years to come, in terms of management of cats, so these are all types of problems, of interactions that we have to take into account. And it's very important to reflect on the different interactions and on the different structures of the ecosystem. So we have to be very informed, and it's not always easy. I know this really well. I know that the speakers who spoke before me talked about this matter, but of course there are very high ecological costs in terms of the loss of species and their extinctions. Here I've put some examples of these financial costs as well, agricultural loss, apiculture, horticulture, fisheries. And of course, there's also some health costs. So what is very important is to act. And once that we have taken into consideration all these elements and we have talked to the local people, we have to decide whether to act or not. And if we act, we have to know how to act. And the first critical thing today is doing preventive control. So before starting to manage the species that are coming or that are already on the island, we have to avoid supplementary introductions. So I put this cartoon here to show you that, we manage these species that have already arrived, but we also have to to close the tap, so to speak. So we have to cut what is coming still from the outside. This is preventive control. These are biosecurity measures, and this needs education and, of course, governance as well. So, of course, we have to involve legal bodies to regulate all these. We have to explain and we have to have the population understand the concepts really well. And to end, I wanted to show you just some examples of the work we have been doing. So here we have some examples of cases that have been failures, but we have learned a lot. For example, the island of Monte Cristo in Italy, bad communication. In Jamaica, we had a lot of failure in our actions in introducing mangosteen for eradicating rats. So there was a cascade of problems because not only the rats were not controlled, but there was also a problem of hyper predators. And so obviously, I'm sorry, but the voice comes and goes, so the sound is not very good. So we have introduced different species as well. The other example is an example for the islands of the Pacific with accidental reintroduction of rats and goats without respecting biosecurity rules that would have avoided problems. This is my last slide. Of course, there's so many examples I could talk about, but these are virtuous examples. So Porquerolles, in the south of France, we have managed to control cats and rats by also monitoring rat populations to avoid that the control on cats was detrimental and was not balanced with the control of rats. And we also have found that predator rats have been using local birds as prey, but it wasn't that catastrophic. So on a demographic level, we have found some benefit in this. Île Surprise in New Caledonia, we've done multiple eradications to avoid relapses of competition. So there were rats and there were mice. And we have carried out multiple eradications, in this case, to preserve local fauna. And then the last example, this initiative was called Taranaki Munga, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and Cape to City. Those are important collaborations, and the important thing to know is that collaboration with communities and the functions of these collaborations is the only solution. It's very important to involve local populations, to have a real accountability, and especially accountability for the long term. Quindi local community, stakeholders, island managers, it's very important to involve everyone. Thank you so much. I'm sorry if I spoke too much. It was perfect. Thank you.
Merci Elsa, c'était riche d'enseignements et
Thank you,
éclairant
Elsa. It was very rich.
Deux petites questions.
I have a couple of questions
avant de passer au débat.
Before we get into the debate. You have spoken about small birds and so many other things, that also functional biodiversity and how difficult it is to communicate this to the general public. Is it better to explain this functional biodiversity? It's not a very emotional subject. How do you present this to people? Well, first of all, it's very important to explain why we preserve biodiversity. It's absolutely important to do this, and then even if it's more complicated, it's important to talk to as many people as possible. Maybe also trying to speak to different groups, to different categories of people. So when we speak to people in simple terms, when we take off the hat of scientists, when we take out the emotional charge and we explain why we are doing this, because we're trying to preserve the functioning of the ecosystem in the best possible way, then people agree with us. Then people start helping us. So, it's very difficult to talk to, farmers or hunters about certain subjects. But if we speak about the importance of the preservation of the biodiversity of the small species, then they listen. Another question, are there species that are easier to eradicate with the help of the communities? For example, cats could be a problem. Maybe it's easier to eradicate rats than cats. Well, of course, it's very difficult with pets, with domestic animals. But, even here, we have to use some good arguments. you know, you cannot avoid people having cats, of course, not even on islands, but you can discuss for the need of sterilizing the cats, for local biodiversity, but also for the health and survival of cats. I had lots of discussions with groomers or, cat people who were even feeding stray cats, and we have been talking about sterilization. We have been telling them that if you don't sterilize cats, they're going to get more ill, they're going to spread illness. So there is this kind of responsibility that you have to explain to people. I'm sorry, but the voice keeps coming and going. So it's very important to do this, especially in fragile environments like the islands. Okay, well, we are going to have more questions on cats. So I would like to ask Julien and Gregg to come back for our Q&A session. I would like to thank Mohamed Abdou, Henriette, and the other ones who have been working with us last year and that are with us today as well, and Philippe Robert, who knows the subject of eradication really well, especially in Port-Cros.
If I speak French, you've got the translation?
Yeah, is it okay if he speaks French because you have the translation, is asking?
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Oui, beaucoup de questions.
So there's lots of questions, especially in relation with communities. One of the most interesting questions, well, all questions are interesting. I'm trying to regroup some of them. There is one that asks about the arguments that are most convincing for communities. So I would like to ask this to Gregg, and also, is there some kind of toolbox that can put together all the different experiences and topics that you can talk to communities about?
Yeah, thank you. I'll start with the toolbox question. There are some resources out there. There's three actually that I can think of right now. The Pacific Invasive Initiative provides a toolkit that you can look at. There's another report from the U.S. National Invasive Species Council, Data Matters, that looks at this. But the third is the literature. There's the publications from the IUCN on island invasives. There's been 4 conferences since 2001 that's looked at island invasives issues. Very much technical, but as the community is maturing, we are starting to talk more about community engagement as our program has evolved, moving from, say, small offshore rocks or islands that are not populated with people. We're moving into more complex islands with people. And our dialogue is shifting into this social space. Historically, we've kind of come at it from very much a science in to community to help them identify their problems and provide solutions. But in reality, these projects, as you've been hearing, especially with our last presenter, it's really about community out is the way we should be approaching these types of programs. Ultimately, it's their programs, it's their the long-term sustainability of these projects really comes from the community. The people need to want it. And the one thing that I've learned along the way is that and this is something that has come up in a recent conversation with a colleague of mine, is that we really need to start thinking about combining our more science approach that we have historically taken, combine it more with local knowledge, and also incorporating some of our traditional ecological knowledge into these programs and projects to help bridge that uncertainty that comes with this social engagement.
Thank you. Let's continue in English because it will be easier for people to avoid to change the channel. We've got a question from David about what are the most common or what are the main mistakes or missing elements during the feasibility studies. that can directly affect the conclusion in your experiences? I will ask the same question to Elsa after that.
Sorry, did you want me to answer that?
Sorry.
Yep. Well, feasibilities are really about can we meet the principles of eradication? And one of the elements that I think that we tend to miss is really, first of all, incorporating understanding why we're pursuing this type of project. With our enthusiasm to pursue the restoration of an island, we tend to lose sight on the why. That ultimately will drive the project and the project success and help us get over challenges and hurdles, articulating the why we're moving forward. And what I'm pointing at is humility that's really missing from these feasibility assessments. Understanding really the challenges that we have in front of us with associated with these projects from a technical scientific perspective. Say targeting rats on an island, a very small island, let's say 10 hectares, it's very crystal clear on what needs to be done, how it needs to be done. But as we get into more complex situations, larger islands, again, islands with people, having a sense of humility incorporated into the feasibility process is something that I think is really needed. Humility does not mean it can't be done. It just means the recognition of the challenges that are in front of us. It's not only technical feasibility, it's about environmental impacts associated with the actions. It's about sustainability of the project long term with the community. It's about capacity. Are the necessary skills, the resources needed to implement safely? Is it, again, socially acceptable? Does it meet the local community needs? And that feeds back to the why of the project. And is it politically acceptable? Can you get the necessary permitting? And finally, the scope and scale. Is the funding, is it realistic to find the funding on a timeline that you're looking at? And really, feasibility not only helps inform how we want to move forward, what we need to do to move forward, but it should also understand what are the uncertainties, what are the limitations, what are the factors that why we cannot move forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Greg. Même question pour Elsa. À ton expérience dans les études de préparation, quels sont vraiment les éléments?
Same question for Elsa. In your study, what are the missing elements that brought to the greatest catastrophes or at least failures? Oh, sorry, I was following in English. So the question is, what are for you the details, the data that are missing and that bring errors and that also bring failure? Well, for me, it's the follow-up. It's measuring biosecurity, is the reintroduction, is monitoring whether this has been successful, is looking at the impact on local communities. So it's very important to keep monitoring, to do a follow-up on the middle term. For me, this is essentially the problem, because preparing everything is easier, but after you have to see if everything that you have planned before was a good idea. Feasibility is also complicated. Eradications, and I've explained it as well, are complicated in a different environment. So there's so many things, there's so many aspects that need to work, that of course we have to think about planning carefully, but monitoring afterwards, for me, is very, very important, and there's no financing for the follow-up. Let's remember that. So I think it's very important. I think this is a classical debate when we talk about projects. You are found a financial aid to start your operation, but after, you have to see if it works or not to keep having financial aid. So, of course, it's a fundamental issue, especially for the financial side of the operation. Julien, same question for you. from the from the plant side, what about the state, and what about all the different eradications? It's very important to understand what were your critical points. With rats and animals, sometimes is easier, but maybe plants can be a little bit more demanding. So what do you think are the fatal mistakes you do at the beginning?
Alors, excusez-moi. Oui, en effet, alors que ce soit au niveau végétal ou animal.
From a plant or animal point of view, I think the fight process is very important. We have to think about it in the long term. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. So we have to think about the fact that we are going to carry out an eradication from 3 to 5 years, whether it's a plant or an animal. Looking behind, it's impossible to do this perfectly, even if we have all the means, even if you're doing really well, I think, and I always repeat it, I think that we have to privilege frequency over intensity. So it's repeated actions that take us there progressively. So it's very important to make everything at an acceptable level, especially in terms of our conservation objectives. Of course, I've been working in the field for 25 years. There have been eradications I thought were very easy, and then they weren't. So it's very important to do your evaluation, and it's very important to understand also the attitude of the population to see if they are, diminishing. And I think that there are cases where the objective is reached, and then we have eradicated the plant. The plant has disappeared, or at least it's less numerous on the island. There are cases where the objective has not been reached, and we have been forced to admit it. And so I think it's very important to privilege frequency over intensity and to carry out a series of corrective actions to really think that we are in for the long run, and we need to involve the population, the local population. And, it's very important to understand that sometimes we think we have won the fight, but we have to make sure that the species don't come back into the island. Thank you so much. Thank you for your contribution about the specific aspect of invasive plants. And then in the next 3 episodes, we are going to take this further. We have looked into the relations with communities. We have seen that these are key. And of course, we work on small islands with no population, but where there is population, we have to bring the communities on board. Could we maybe share some tips in terms of this experience, maybe some interesting or atypical experiences that helped you taking the population on board, the local population on board? I am going to start with Julien, because I can see he's already got an answer in his head because of his large experience of mobilitating communities. Yes, sure. So I will speak about Gombrani. This is a small island in the Rodrigue, in the south of Rodrigue. So I've been working a lot with local NGOs. I've asked them to help to create an action plan. So pragmatically, we have spoken through video calls. And for 4 days of mission. So the first day was devoted to meet with all of the stakeholders, and we started discussing Gombrani. They explained to me what they have been doing so far, and I have been able to explain how to do restoration and how to understand all of these pre-analysis that looked very interesting to me. And this is very important because I think that sometimes if we all go straight on the site, we can miss a few things because maybe the rarest plants are small. So it's very important to understand where the areas are well preserved and to differentiate the different zones, the different areas of the island. Second and third day, we started going throughout the island, 40 hectares of island. The objective was to have a shared diagnostics. And everyone realized at that point that some habitats, they thought they were well protected, but in fact they were invaded by different species. Fourth day, we kind of did a wrap-up of all of the actions that we have been taking over the past 4 days, and we have established priorities. And I think that the community, the locals, have really come on board at that point because they were doing actions and they have understood that the specificity of their island was those unique habitats, and it was important to preserve them. And there were some plants, endemic plants, that they needed to take care of because they were starting to disappear. So I think the shared diagnostics is much more important than telling them what to do. And I think that we have to get there all together because it's a very delicate topic. We have to exchange best practices. And I do think that this process had a really great value. Sharing, therefore, thank you. Sharing on site. So, yes, certainly it's very important to have something that brings communities together. I would insist on specificity of habitats that we are protecting, specificity of species, showing the island inhabitants and the local communities on site. And this becomes a beacon because once they understand, once we show them examples, then, you know, they come on board, they integrate. And especially showing examples of what they need to do or how they can help. This certainly is a great asset for us. I try always to, you know, really inform, to speak in podcasts, at the radio, to spread lots of information. Thank you. Thanks, Gregg, because he's been sharing on the chat some interesting links so that we can get informed. Thank you so much, Gregg. Gregg.
Same question for you. Any tips or any good experience you had to share the needs of eradication with local communities?
Yeah. The one thing that struck me is that we're talking a lot about bringing communities along and bringing them on board. And one of the interesting experiences that I'm working with communities in the Pacific right now where they are on board. They are very interested. They want to pursue the eradication. And it turns then into a now what? We have everybody saying, okay, you've convinced us, or we want this to happen. How do we work together now to move forward? And what I'm finding is there's a necessity for creating structure to having the dialogue for the technical elements now going forward, creating process, creating the forum, the platforms for communities to engage as we work through the development and the implementation of a project. And in a very simple way, what we're creating is two things. One is very high level, which is a focus on project steering committee, which includes the decision makers. And then there's a project management committee, which is essentially the people that work to develop and implement on the ground. And then associated with it are some technical advisors that are on the side. It's really, for success, it's really important because as communities are engaged and they're moving forward, there's many voices, and creating the space for them in the right place to have the right message sent to the right people is really critical. Otherwise, it just turns into everybody involved with everybody's business, and it turns into a very chaotic and challenging environment to operate.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe last question for each of you. Greg, we continue in English. What are, in your opinion, the points that are not scientific but logistical, operational, that could be included in the feasibility and could conduct to the conclusion that it's impossible to do?
At what point does a project, well, that's a decision I think that's associated with a community. And there's two sides of it, which is the technical side. Where does this project fit into the global picture? And I'll point to a database in a minute that you can look at. Obviously, the project at some point is just physically just too large to do. Not every island eradication is not possible on every island. There are limits at this point. But from a social, sort of the non-essential elements, it's not one single element that determines the success or failure, potential success or the potential risk associated with implementing a project. It's all of them combined and how they interact with each other that really is important. And that's why I just highlighted creating these project steering committees creates that environment for everybody to assess and understand those essential non-scientific, non-technical elements that have to work together. But at the end of the day, from what I've seen, what's the most limiting and what's the most important factor that will determine long-term success is funding. Funding is the major hurdle, major driver. Inevitably, you see many programs start with high degree of enthusiasm, high degree of interest. You have all the pieces ready to go, but lack of funding or the funding is just too small, and it essentially financially it doesn't complete because there's just no more funding.
Thank you. Yes, I love this sentence. When there's no money, we don't speak about conservation. Well, without money, conservation is just conversation. That's it. Sorry. Oui, pour Julien, sur l'aspect invasif végétal.
About the plant invasive aspect, how do we tackle a territory where there are a lot of multiple invasions by the plants? How do we choose? Where do we start from? Do we think about the plant cycle? So I would like you to sum up the main criteria just in a few words. Well, it's important to make a comprehensive list, to be honest, because we can't, sometimes people target one or two species. However, when you have several experts, everyone brings their own bread to the basket. So they all say we have to think about this or about that. The most well-known species that have an impact are important, of course, but when you go on site, sometimes you see that there are species that have already invaded, and this is the case on coastal areas. So sometimes, targeting the most well-known plants doesn't serve very much. On the other hand, sometimes there are species that are endemic, indigenous, and we have to identify those. In Rodrigo, there was a casuarina, I spoke about it before. This is globally known. And we have realized that there were some plants that had been floating from the main island, and they were starting regrouping, and they had started making seeds, etc. So this is what we have to target, I think, as well, and identify. And so the notion of impact also has to be carefully studied. Is it indigenous species? Is it exotic species? Is it minor species? Some species that are not covering all large areas of the island. So we have to take everything into account. So we have to also understand that these frameworks are evolving constantly. Sometimes I went on an island where opuntia were problematic, and when I went there, I saw other species who were much more invasive than opuntias. And of course, in 20 years of action, some other species progress. So this is typical of the sites where we work. So it's very important to take the time to make a proper assessment. Of course, we cannot forecast everything to start with, but we can study, we can make follow-ups, and we can reassess frequently. Thank you. So if you are still here, I'm going to give you the results of our survey. Now, I would like to ask a question to Elsa about control and biosecurity. So, in terms of regulating risks for reinfestation, are there some legal tools or communication tools or techniques that we can use to prevent this from happening again? Well, I think there is one message important, one takeaway from today, and it is we have to improve legislation at different levels. Some pieces of legislation are already very positive. There are mentionings of different native and indigenous species that can be transferred. But at the same time, we have to foster native biodiversity. So I think legislation is very important. I think we have to insist on the functionality and specificity. And then we have something to base ourselves on, some rights to base ourselves on. I think it's an important strategy for action. It's very important, especially when we find some species that are extremely invasive. And so we have to create some lists that are also spread through horticulture experts. You know, sometimes people plant these plants in their garden, so this is what needs changing. And I think legislation can be a big help in these terms of specificity. Thank you. This was great conclusion. So we are going to talk about the next webinar, which is going to be on Thursday, March 12th. I would like to thank our three speakers and Gregg, who kindly continues to share some interesting links. So thank you so much for everyone. Thanks, Gregg. Thanks, Julien, because it's very late for you. And thank you for your contribution. Thanks to Elsa for your presence and your generosity in communicating. Thanks, everyone. So I'll see you next Thursday. We were not able to answer to all the questions. We had some very interesting questions, and we'll try and answer to more questions next Thursday. So thank you. Thanks, everyone. And we hope for durable investments. So thanks, everyone, and see you next week. Thank you.
Merci, thank you.
Et bonne lutte.